Some of y'all are old enough to remember this, and if you do, what I'm about to say is going to be stuck in your head all week. Saturday morning, cereal, cartoons, little animated segment with a catchy song. As your body grows bigger, your mind must flower. It's great to learn because knowledge is power. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Schoolhouse Rock. Listen, if you don't know what Schoolhouse Rock is, you have not lived. Get on YouTube right now. Not right now, not right this minute. Like when you get home. Schoolhouse Rock. It was designed for us Gen X kids to make us smarter without us realizing that's what they were trying to do to us. And I learned about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. I learned how conjunctions function. I learned how bills become laws, how interplanet Janet does what interplanet, why Zero's my hero. I learned all kinds of stuff from Schoolhouse Rock with this mantra of knowledge is power. And that's not just a lyric, it's a worldview. It's a way to live. And if you know more, you'll be safer. If you understand more, you'll be steadier. If you can see what's happening, if you can learn, you won't be fooled, you won't be manipulated, you won't be caught off guard. Knowledge is power, it'll help you in life. And the reality is there's true. Scripture treats knowledge as a gift. Learning as a gift. God doesn't call us to be ignorant people. In fact, He tells us we are transformed by the renewing of our hearts. No, we get new hearts. We're transformed by the renewing of our minds. But Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 12, forces us to face something that most of us did not learn in childhood, and that's what happens when knowledge gives you insight, but it doesn't bring you peace. Many of us have more information than we wanted. We know more than we're ever going to do with that information. We see problems, we see motives, we see corruption, we see brokenness in systems, brokenness in relationships, brokenness in ourselves. Books and books and books on self-help and how to diagnose your problems and what's your emotional IQ or whatever, EQ or whatever the new buzz thing is that's going around in the moment. IQ's out, EQ's in. But instead of feeling powerful, we feel like it's just too much. We know too much to be naive, but we don't know enough to fix anything. In fact, there's a point where you just realize there's just too much, it's just unfixable. And that's what Solomon's talking about here in Ecclesiastes 1. Solomon's not writing as someone who avoided wisdom, he's writing as someone who chased it. And what he found was not control, and was not relief, and it wasn't the kind of power that Schoolhouse Rock promised us kids. What he found was grief. And last week we talked about what life feels like when it's lived under the sun, when meaning has only coming, our only meaning comes from inside this world that we live in. Today Solomon's going to take a step further, and he's going to show us what happens when our best thinking runs into the limits that it can't push past, it can't cross. And he begins to teach us this shift. And it's actually a shift we're going to need for this whole series. Not less wisdom, but wisdom in its proper place. Wisdom lived above the sun, viewed above the sun. 29 times in this book, Solomon uses the phrase, under the sun. When you see that much in anything, you have to take it serious. What is he talking about here? And when he talks about wisdom under the sun, he's describing life as it looks and feels when you never lift your eyes off the ground. But this life is the only frame of reference you use. Meaning has to come from what you can see, what you can achieve, what you can control, what you understand, because nothing beyond this world is shaping how you see it. And that kind of life, wisdom in that life, slowly gets asked to replace God. But when we talk about wisdom above the sun, We're talking about a life lived with God as our reference point, our center point. Not a life without problems, but a life where meaning doesn't rise and fall based on circumstances. Doesn't rise and fall based on knowledge, because it's anchored in a God who is and what he's done. And that's where we're going this morning. So Solomon's about to show us that wisdom, when pursued under the sun, doesn't rescue us from brokenness of life. It exposes it, sometimes painfully. Let's look at just really briefly. We'll start in verse 1. Start at verse 12, chapter 1. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. Now, this is a repeat of the beginning of last week. This is how he starts it. Not to boast, but he's removing any excuses from his readers. This isn't theory. This isn't a philosopher who's detached from life. This is the king. He's the guy that ruled, the guy that governed, the guy that dealt with the problems, the guy that carried the responsibility. He lived with the consequences. And if anyone had the resources to see how the world works, it was him. But in verse 13, he says, I applied my heart to seek and search out wisdom, all that is done under heaven. And this is a really important phrase here, because Solomon, this is the guy that actually prayed for wisdom. God showed up to Solomon in a vision right after he became king and said, Solomon, I'll grant you anything you want. Tell me what you need to rule. And he said, God, give me wisdom. And God said, yes, I'll give you wisdom. And then right here, Solomon says, not only I applied my heart to wisdom. So Solomon didn't treat that as God, give me patience. I'm standing here, God, I'm waiting on you to give me patience. No, he pursued wisdom on top of this gift that God had given him. So he didn't skim the surface, he applied it. That's not casual curiosity, it's discipline. It's a sustained pursuit. And it's important to note that when he talks about wisdom here in verse 13, now look, this is very, 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 gotta get our brains wrapped around this. When he's talking about wisdom right here in this text, he's not talking about the godly wisdom that's rooted in the fear of the Lord. He's talking about wisdom lived under the sun. Okay? Wisdom treated as a way to master life. Wisdom treated as a way to explain everything. And wisdom is the way we're going to secure peace with God, peace with ourselves. The kind of wisdom that literally cannot carry that kind of weight. So Ecclesiastes is not anti-thinking. It's not anti-knowledge. It's not suspicious of learning. He's not being dismissive. He's saying, look, wisdom, I take wisdom seriously because God takes wisdom seriously, and he knows that the ability to know and learn are gifts of God. We're going to see this pattern all through the book when he talks about things like relationships and work and pleasure and all these things. All these are good things he's talking about. Yes, he's coming at it from a very negative standpoint because that's the whole point. But lived under the sun, they're not going to bring us meaning, even though they're good gifts. And so the issue here in this particular part of Ecclesiastes is not intelligence, it's autonomy. Solomon is pursuing this honestly and thoroughly and sincerely. And he's saying, look, you can't judge me from lack of trying. I tried it. The most qualified voice in the room to answer the question of how to fix what's broken in this world was Solomon. And the unsettling reality that he unfolds here in this book is that wisdom can show us the problem in high definition without giving us the power to change it. And that's where he takes us next. That wisdom exposes the problem, but it can't resolve it. Look at the second half of 13. It's an unhappy business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. Now this phrase, if it unsettles you, it should. God has given us unhappy business. Solomon's not just saying life is difficult. He's saying that the work of understanding the world, this effort that trying to figure out how everything fits together in that struggle is actually a burden that's designed by God and given to humanity. Now, why does he sound so negative here? I think he's challenging the audience, saying, look, I'm going to confront something that runs deep, and it ran deep in this group that Solomon was writing to, and it still runs deep in us today. The idea that if we pursue knowledge deeply enough, if we understand life clearly enough, we're going to finally feel settled. This insight is going to give our lives weight and significance if we can just know more, know the right thing. And Solomon says, look, I applied my heart to wisdom. I did the work. I asked the hard questions. And I did not discover fulfillment. I discovered frustration, not because wisdom is pointless, but because that's not where the answers are found. Look at 14. I've seen everything that's done under the sun. And behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. So he's not confused here. He says, I've seen it. He's clear-eyed. He understands the system, the patterns, the outcomes, the cycles of life we talked about last week, and the clarity did not bring relief. In fact, it brought the opposite. Wisdom showed him the problem in full color. It exposed the futility, the repetition, the limits, but it did not give him a way out. He can name it, he can analyze it, he can describe it, but he's still trapped inside of it. And I think that's where a lot of people find themselves today. We assume that if we can explain our discontent or it's going to loosen its grip, all right? If we can just understand the why. God, if you just tell me why I'm going through this, it's going to lift the weight. Ecclesiastes says, no, understanding explains the ache. It doesn't heal it. And he goes further. He refuses. This is so interesting in this text. He doesn't want us to believe that wisdom fails because God is absent. He actually says wisdom fails because God is present. Think about that. This intellectual task, this pursuit of answers, still exists under the umbrella of the sovereignty of God. We're dealing with creaturehood here, trying to be something we're not, and that means that wisdom is going to run into walls that we can't pass through. And the problem's not that life doesn't make sense. The problem is that life's governed by a God who's not going to submit to our rules and our desires and our explanations. And it's deeply frustrating if we think understanding is what's going to bring us peace. Again, Solomon's not anti-intellectual. He's actually anti-illusion. He's like, look, I'm going to strip away the belief that knowledge is going to deliver this permanent meaning and lasting peace that you think it's going to bring. Wisdom can tell you what's wrong with the world. It just cannot tell you how to fix it. And once wisdom takes you that far, once it shows you the problem without resolving it, you're forced to face a deeper question. Not why is life like this, but what do I do when understanding and knowledge is not enough? I see this happening a lot in the tech world. I follow some tech guys and because they're just kind of at the cutting edge of some things, and I like to kind of hear how things are going. And I was listening to actually even Andrew Huberman this week talking about how he spent his life as an atheist because he thought knowledge was going to bring him peace. He said it wasn't until a year ago when all of a sudden that voice in his head that kept telling him, you should pray. And he started praying. And then all of a sudden thought, well, if I'm praying, maybe I should get a Bible and start reading that Bible. So he started reading his Bible. And then he started going to church. And then he thought, wait, there's actually something to this whole thing. And a guy that was interviewing him this week said, what happens if you find out when you die that it was just brain synapses? You know, all of a sudden you changed the way your brain fires and it brought you peace. He said, okay. I still had peace. You know why? He didn't have the language to say it, but he'd stopped living under the sun. and relying on his own knowledge and went something outside of himself. Now, verse 15 really, really hits us. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Cannot. Solomon says, look, let's talk about the reality we're always going to run into when we're basic thinking knowledge and wisdom and understanding under the sun is going to fix our problems. There are limits in this world that knowledge cannot cross because God has put some walls in place by design. Now, we know that's designed is the kind of thing that forced a guy like Andrew Huberman to say, maybe I should start praying. Maybe I should go read the Bible, right? This is where Ecclesiastes becomes especially uncomfortable for independent people. We assume if a problem can't be solved, it's because we just haven't thought hard enough about it. Solomon says, no, not necessarily. Some things remain crooked because God made them crooked. Some things are lacking because God made them lacking. And there's not enough authority in all of humanity to straighten the crooked. Wisdom can identify the bend, it can't remove it. And wisdom can name what's missing, but only God can fill those holes. And so it's not a failure of intellect, it's a boundary that God himself has set up. And what I think Solomon understands is this is the part we resist and push back on. The pursuit of knowledge doesn't place us above the system. So the intellectuals, the geniuses, the thinkers, the analysts, the planners, all these people are just as much under God's authority as the clueless, the naive. That's why I think verse 15 sounds so final. I mean, this is an unhappy business God has assigned. So the thing is, we live, especially now, with all the technology and everything that's coming, not what's here, what's coming is just nuts, right? We live in a world that assumes everything's fixable. Every problem has a solution. Every limit can be overcome. Every obstacle, technical, political, whatever. If we just have enough data, enough policy, enough innovation, enough pressure, enough money, then surely we have straightened that crooked thing. Solomon says, wrong. See, Solomon says that assumption's false, not because people are lazy, not because they're uneducated, not because they don't care enough, because God, in his sovereignty, placed walls. Some things remain crooked because God did not give us the power to straighten them. One of the ways, I thought about this a lot this week, one of the ways I think this most shows up, I mean, I don't know if y'all been paying attention, but last week there's been a lot going on in the world, right? Like a lot. Last 2 weeks of December were kind of like, and then just all of a sudden, okay, all right, here we go, 2026. I think a lot of modern day activism, even though it might be motivated genuinely by concern for others, is driven by an unspoken belief that if we truly care, we can fix it. If something's broken, then we've failed. Somebody didn't try hard enough, they didn't think clearly enough, somebody didn't organize well enough. And Solomon in this section, he's not denying compassion. He's not dismissing justice. He's not excusing indifference. He's just saying control is a fantasy. Because when Solomon says some crooked can't be made straight, here's what he means by that. There are some griefs that you have that are not problems to be solved. They're burdens to carry. And there's limitations that you have that are not failures of imagination. They're actually features of a fallen world. And suffering is not evidence that you haven't tried hard enough or done enough. It's simply a reality that we live in on this side of heaven. And that is deeply offensive to a culture that equates goodness and power and effectiveness and righteousness. And in our moment, to admit limits to some people says it's moral failure. And to acknowledge that we can't fix something is unloving or lacks empathy or whatever the new language is. To say something is beyond us sounds irresponsible. But Ecclesiastes says the opposite. Because, what Solomon's trying to do is get us to humble ourselves and realize who we are, lived under the sun. So this humility is not cruelty, and so if it's a recognition that this world doesn't belong to us, we are creatures, we're not the creator. And this is the part that I think really matters, hits us as individuals. Most people I know aren't angry at the limits, they're just exhausted by them. I know people that have been told implicitly or explicitly that if something in their life is still broken, it's their fault. And that's not always true. If a relationship hasn't healed, it's your fault. If anxiety hasn't been lifted, it's your fault. It's something you're doing. You just got to fix it. Listen, I was this your fault person most of my life. I was the person that thought, there's nothing out there that can't be fixed. Oh, you got a bad relationship with your parents? Well, let me tell you how to fix that. Oh, you're dealing with anxiety? Well, let me tell you how to stop it, right? Y'all seen the Bob Newhart sketch, the Stop It sketch, where he's a psychologist and the person comes in and says, I have a pathological need to wash my hands. And he's like, well, stop it. And then it ends with, stop doing that or I'll bury you in a box, right? If you hadn't seen that, when you get home, watch that too. It's funny. I was a stop it guy. Until I realized I wasn't as in control as I thought I was. When some things that mentally I should have been able to control in my head, where I literally told myself, driving to Loma Linda Hospital, getting nauseous on the way to the hospital because I had what's called anticipatory nausea. You know what that is? It's where your body tells itself, you're a moron and I'm going to protect you from yourself. Stop taking me over there and doing to me what you do to me every 2 weeks. But in my head, I could tell myself, Jim, stop it, Scott. This is dumb. You shouldn't be nauseous. Something inside my head was like, you can say that all you want. Go get the wheelchair, Lisa, so you can get him inside this hospital. He doesn't pass out when the door's open. There was no sucking it up. There was no convincing myself that it was stupid. Sometimes grief lingers. Sometimes the world feels heavy. And learning enough and adjusting enough is not going to fix it. Sometimes it's just not your fault. I hate to say this, but sometimes there is no fixing that relationship. Solomon says not everything's fixable. Not everything's repairable. Now that's not actually resignation here. That's a mercy. Because when you realize that, where does it force you to rely? On yourself? No, you've got to go beyond. If you're going to get peace, you've got to go beyond something other than yourself. I think wisdom lived under the sun collapses when it tries to become sovereign, and compassion becomes crushing when it's asked to do something that only God can do. And look, don't mishear me. Ecclesiastes is not asking us to disengage from the world. It's actually calling us to put our efforts back in their proper place. Faithfulness instead of control, love instead of management, obedience instead of illusion. I wrote up a lot of tech stuff this week because apparently I spent a lot of time listening to. This week I listened to a 3-hour interview with some tech gurus who were interviewing Elon Musk. I don't care what you think of Elon Musk, the dude's a genius. And like him or love him or hate him or whatever, the dude's a genius. You're literally watching a modern day, whatever, past genius, pick it, Leonardo da Vinci or whatever. And they interviewed him for 3 hours, and I'll be honest with you, about a third of it, I had no idea what they were talking about. Right? They're using terminology I didn't understand. It's tech stuff I didn't understand, but so I just had to wade through that, get to the parts I could understand. But much of it, the reason I was listening to it was a lot of it was about AI and robots and the future, and they were asking him in his view, because that's obviously he's at the forefront of that, what does he see the world shaped like by this technology in the future, near future and far future? And so he was asked this question. He was asked, is he concerned about AI and robotics taking over jobs? Because that's like the big conversation right now. And he said no, he has other concerns. His concern is not that AI and robotics is going to take over jobs, and all of a sudden everybody's going to be living in this like dystopian, poor, like we're all living like what's the movie in LA where they bomb the thing, like, that. No, he said he had a bigger concern that people would struggle to find meaning in the future when they had abundance, but hadn't earned it through work. I thought, well, that's an interesting angle from a tech guy. And he talked about what he sees as the coming reality. Now, look, I don't have any idea if you guys knows what he's talking about or not, but this is just telling you what he said. He talked about the coming reality where goods and services, because of AI and robotics, are going to become so cheap and so abundant, particularly like healthcare is one thing he kept talking about, that most people will effectively have what he called it universal high income. And at one point, he even suggested that he thinks in like the next 10 or 20 years, saving for retirement would just be a waste of money. I thought, okay. I mean, he does call himself a pathological optimist. So I don't know if he's right about the future. Irrelevant, right? Time will tell. But there was a moment in the conversation that caught my attention because it sounded strangely like Ecclesiastes. He was asked about how he thought the transformation was going to happen. Like, all right, how are we going to go from now till, because he was talking about like some things happening. He says 5 years from now that were just centuries move. And he said, is it going to lead to chaos or is it going to lead to peace? He said, well, it's going to have both. Well, he said, of course it would. Here's why. He said, not because technology will fail. The technology will be there. He said, but because of human nature. Because no matter how advanced the system becomes, you still have to deal with things like greed and pride and fear and injustice. He said, there's no way to get around those things. Technology can't overcome those things. And I was like, whoa, come on, Elon. And I think what he understands, whether he frames it theologically or not, is that progress doesn't change the human heart. You can improve tools, you can expand knowledge, you can increase efficiency, but the core problem remains: the crooked does not straighten itself. And Ecclesiastes has been saying that for thousands of years. And I think that's where culture and theology kind of meet, because culturally, we live in an assumption that if we can just advance far enough and innovate enough and understand enough, then we can solve every problem. We're going to fix disease, and we're going to fix death and all this stuff, which means ultimately, in the future, we're going to be our own saviors. And what becomes our hope is progress. And theologically, Ecclesiastes says that if you're asking creation to do the work of the Creator, you're going to fail. Solomon's not denying progress. He's denying that redemption comes through progress, through systems, through technology. There's no accumulation of wisdom that's going to heal what's broken deepest inside humanity. That even a guy like Elon Musk said, you cannot overcome human nature. There's no technology to do that. No amount of advancement removes the limits God's placed on human beings, the limits that came at the fall. And I think the frustration that Solomon names here is not that the world's not going to improve, it's that the world's never going to reach the place that it thinks it'll reach if it just can figure out more. And the deeper issue in Ecclesiastes is that what's pressing on is humanity keeps trying to get redemption from inside the system, from under the sun. And we keep assuming that if we can just get smart enough and organized enough and powerful enough that we can fix what's wrong inside of us. Ecclesiastes says that's going to bring you grief. Not because knowledge is bad. Not because progress is meaningless. Because finite creatures we're never meant to carry the responsibility. That only God can carry. And then verse 16 through 18, let's look at it. Solomon basically in 16, he's reflecting on his pursuit of wisdom and what it's produced. He says, look, basically, I became wiser than anybody before me. I saw more, understood more, and I delivered. Verse 18, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I want to read that again. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now, Solomon's honest with us here. Wisdom sharpens vision, but it doesn't soften the reality. It exposes brokenness, and once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. Clarity doesn't automatically bring peace. Solomon says clarity under the sun is actually going to bring frustration. It's going to bring sorrow. There's a moment. Everybody experiences it. Now, some people at certain levels experience it. There's a moment that happens with kids where you realize that your parents aren't exactly who you thought they were growing up. They don't have it all figured out, no matter how much they pretended when you were a kid. Right? And some people handle those moments well, and some people don't. There's moments where you realize how the world actually works, where things aren't as neat and tidy and black as white as we thought they were at one point. When the systems are exposed, and when the promises don't hold, and when the shortcuts reveal as lies, when the fraud is all of a sudden just laid out there before us. And those moments feel like maturity, but they can also be painful, because when wisdom pulls back the curtain and shows you the crookedness, it shows you the limits, and it shows you how deep the fractures run, and the more you see, the heavier it feels. And one of the cultural pressures that I think this passage presses on right now and where we're living is there's a confusion that I see regularly with people, especially in conversations about politics and culture, where they confuse cynicism with wisdom. We're watching that play out every day. I'll tell you what I mean. So think of it like this, all right? And y'all know I don't talk about politics much, but it's too good of an example not to use it. All right? We're in America, so we got Republicans and Democrats. Pick your side. I got mine. So one side, people describing themselves as having been red-pilled. If you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter. On the other side, people will used to describe themselves as being woke, which means just I'm awakened. The language is different, but the logic's the same, because what they're claiming is there was a moment where I became awakened to actually what's going on out there, and it suggests that I can now see what others can't see, and they both imply that they've now gained some unique and special insight. And more often than not, what that insight brings is not wisdom, it brings cynicism. Once people stop being naive, they assume that they've arrived at wisdom, but that's not wisdom. Suspicion of institutions can feel like maturity. Constant skepticism is treated as discernment. Assuming hidden motives in everything becomes a badge of intelligence. If you trust anything or anyone too easily, you must be asleep. And Ecclesiastes right here pushes back on that instinct. Solomon didn't stumble into cynicism. He chased wisdom as hard as anyone. He applied his heart to it. He looked honestly at the world, the systems, the patterns, the outcomes. And instead of finding peace, he found grief. Not because knowledge is bad, but because under the sun, wisdom can only show you what's broken. It can't fix the problem. So cynicism starts as clarity. It wakes people up. It pulls back the curtain. It exposes the corruption and the hypocrisy and the false promises. But if you stay there, it will destroy you. I see clearly, but I trust nothing. I understand the problem, but I got nowhere to stand. There's a version of wisdom live under the sun where it's a gift. It's not a gift, it's a curse. You'd have been better off to have stayed ignorant. Because cynicism doesn't make you wise. It makes you hopeless. And Ecclesiastes is not trying to move us back into naivety. It's not telling us close our eyes and pretend the world's better off than it is. It's not telling us ignorance is bliss. It's not that shallow. But he's also not willing to leave us content with suspicion and despair. What he wants to do, the goal, where he's headed, is moving forward in humility and trust and recognition that seeing clearly is not the same thing as seeing fully. Understanding the problem is not the same thing as being able to solve it. And wisdom reaches a point where it's either going to harden into cynicism or it's going to bend into dependence in the one who is above the sun. And that's where real wisdom begins. Because it gives you somewhere to trust. And now when we finally think we've seen everything, when we recognize that even the clearest visions that we gain has limits, and those limits are not a failure of intelligence, they're an invitation to us to trust in the one that lives above the sun. And Solomon's teaching us that wisdom under the sun, left to itself, will always end in grief. But that grief's not pointless. What it's meant to do is loosen your grip on the illusion of you in control. That if I can just know more, if I can just get this in my head. No, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Solomon's shown us here. He didn't reject wisdom. That'd be key. He's not rejecting wisdom. He's relocating it. He's showing us what wisdom can do pursued under the sun. It can clarify and expose. It can wake us up. It can strip away illusions. It can even show us the truth about the way the world is. Well, those are all good things. But it cannot carry the weight of meaning and deliver the peace we're looking for. Above the sun, wisdom takes on a different role. Above the sun, wisdom begins with submission. It's received before it's applied. It listens before it evaluates. It acknowledges limits before it tries to explain them. It doesn't exist to solve the problems of life, but to teach us how to live faithfully within it. Let me give you a really good example. Y'all know this week, I had no idea until this week how many experts there are on Venezuela. Did y'all know? Did y'all know there are millions of people that have apparently spent the last 26 years studying all the issues going on with the issues surrounding Venezuela and the oil and the communism and all that stuff? I had no idea. No idea. I just stayed out of it. I felt like I was the man. I shouldn't even get involved in this. I don't know what's going on. I just know we're doing that and took Maduro off. Huh? It's not wisdom. It's not even knowledge. I don't know what you call that. Moving from under the sun to above the sun doesn't mean thinking less. It means trusting more. Above the sun, wisdom stops promising control. It starts cultivating humility, and it stops feeding cynicism. It starts forming trust. And that's why Scripture says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Think about that. Fear of the Lord is not the finish line. It's the doorway. The beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, that's not the reward for understanding in its proper attitude. It's actually how we start the proper attitude to gain understanding. We start with the fear of the Lord. We don't start with ourselves and work towards the fear of the Lord. That's not wisdom. And living above the sun is not pretending life's better than it is. Solomon's not saying that. It's not optimism. It's not denial. It's not escaping the world. It's a reordering of where our meaning comes from, where our hope comes from, where our trust comes from. And under the sun, if we look to wisdom and understanding and all these things as control, it's too heavy. We've got to stop asking created things to carry divine weight. That's where the gospel matters the most. To move from under the sun to above the sun is not anything we're ever going to achieve by thinking better. It's something we receive because God has acted on our behalf. And so the God who stands above the sun, think about this, was not distant. The gospel says the one that lived above the sun came under the sun, stepped into the repetition and the frustration and the sorrow and the limits that Solomon describes right here in the text. He experienced the weariness of life. He experienced what Solomon's describing. The injustice of the world, the grief that wisdom alone can't fix. But guess what? He came as the fix. Somebody asked me just a couple of weeks ago why I didn't name that little devotional Living Above the Sun, S-O-N. And I was like, because that's not the word used in Ecclesiastes, but ultimately it is living not above S-O-N, because that's not possible, but how about just living with? Jesus bore the vanity, the futility, the meaninglessness, the worthless that Solomon talks about here of the life lived under the sun. And guess what? He can make the crooked straight. He can fill what's lacking. He can bring meaning. God declared meaning doesn't end in vapor. It ends in redemption. So what does living above the sun actually mean? It means when your wisdom finally runs out, trust Christ. When you've done all you can manage, anchor yourself in God. When you have realized ruling your heart's not working, let the Word inform your life. That's what living above the sun means. Practically, it looks like learning to turn clarity into dependence instead of cynicism. When wisdom exposes something broken, what do? You don't harden, you pray. And when understanding reveals limits you can't cross, you don't despair, you trust. And when life feels heavy and unresolved, and you stop asking it to explain itself, and you start just resting in a God that you know is in control. Above the sun, peace doesn't come from answers, it comes from belonging. It comes from being able to say, I'm known by God, I'm held by Christ, and I'm not responsible for carrying the weight of the world. And Ecclesiastes is going to continue to show us how to live wisely in a world that remains crooked. It's only going to make sense as we move forward if we remember this. Wisdom under the sun exposes the problem. Wisdom above the sun lives by faith in God, who already acted to make the crooked straight. It's not the end of the journey, but we are headed in the right direction. Amen.